Chagos was the final straw for me. It's a damning indictment of our foreign policy and defence establishment.
I don't think even the ministers really know what our sort of approach is to foreign policy at the moment.
We've got to be honest with ourselves. This is more than two connected regional wars. We are in a period of world chaos. I think we need to have a lot more courage in telling the public just how bad it is.
Hello and welcome to Coffee House. I'm James Heale.
And I'm Tim Shipman.
Today we're going to be talking about how to fix the Foreign Office and the future of the special relationship with America. And we're delighted to be joined by two excellent guests. We've got David Lammy's former SPAD, Ben Judah, and Ameer Kotecha, who resigned this week from the Foreign Office over various criticisms. Ameer, could you summarise a piece for us you wrote in the Times?
Yeah, thanks, James. Essentially what I said in the Times is that the Foreign Office is hopelessly distracted by the peripheral, and that is all to the neglect of its core mission, right? So I give sort of woke examples, woke distraction. So I say that I was invited to a World Afro Day celebration 5 years ago when Kabul was falling to the Taliban, and right up to the present, when the main story on the Foreign Office intranet, and I think that's a good sort of sign of the senior messaging, or a good example of the senior messaging to staff, is about, again, some corporate irrelevance, how to seize your self-development. So, it does feel like sort of fiddling while Rome burns. We've got a war raging in the Middle East, and I just worry that the Foreign Office is distracted by corporate issues, by insular navel-gazing, by sort of woke excesses. And as I say, it's all kind of, I think, to the abandonment of a focus, a really ruthless focus, on the real foreign policy issues of the day.
What was the last straw for you then, Ameer? It's a big deal to resign from a job like that. Why did you do it ultimately?
Chagos was the final straw for me, but the frustrations have been building for a long time. But I just see in Chagos an example of all of these problems coming together. There's lots to say about Chagos, but ultimately, I think, however you look at it, it's a damning indictment of our foreign policy and defence establishment, right? I mean, Ben wrote a great piece, I thought, giving the steel man for Chagos. But even that, if you boil it down, it essentially kind of comes down to the point that if the Chinese land on one of those atolls, we don't have the means to defend it. We can't defend a bit of sovereign territory from foreign foes. And so, for me, however you look at the Chagos deal, it's wrong. We shouldn't be doing it. We should be holding on to a British overseas territory. That was the final straw, Tim.
Look, we don't want to talk too much about Chagos because we've done it to death on this broadcast. But what do you make of Ameer's sort of criticisms of the Foreign Office in general? You were there, just over a year, was it?
That's right.
Yeah.
So what I found advising a Foreign Secretary and sitting next to one in the Grand Office is that each of these very powerful teams was sending up very contradictory pieces of advice. The Middle East team would be pushing international law in the General Assembly first. The Russia-Ukraine team would be saying Zelensky is the priority. The embassy in Washington, which really is a government department in and of itself, given its size,
hundreds of people there,
would be saying special relationship über alles. And, my job was to try and make sense of this and stack this up. What that reflects is not any particular team doing something wrong. It's that Britain's old grand strategy, that you can be great champion of international law, ferocious critic of the Kremlin and America's best friend, doesn't really stack up right now in Trump's new world.
And that whole thing of being a bridge between America and between America and Europe more generally that was a sort of fundamental thing, and Brexit kind of eroded that a bit, may not have done away with it altogether, but it feels like we don't really know what our foreign policy is. And now when you were working with David Lammy, you worked together on something called progressive realism, which was supposed to be sort of imposing a structure over all of that. What happened with that? It doesn't feel like that's something the government, the Prime Minister particularly invested in or adopted. Part of the problem with this Iran thing in recent days has been I don't think even the ministers really know what our sort of approach is to foreign policy at the moment. Is that fair?
We need, in this stormy weather, to have realism as our guide through the storm. And with progressive realism, what we were trying to do is do realism for Labour.
Yep.
Realism for Labour is always going to be slightly different from realism for Reform or the Conservative Party, but that's what we were trying to do. We were trying to impose realpolitik on the Foreign Office. And, I agree with some of the criticisms that Ameer has sort of referenced here. An area where I was most frustrated in the Foreign Office was I felt a a real weakness when it came to policy planning and actually coming up with propositional ideas. The teams that dealt with crisis, I thought was actually pretty good.
Yeah.
But when I wanted new ideas, there wasn't enough there.
And is that a lack of experience in different parts of the world? I think, Ameer, you said we actually, this used to be the Rolls-Royce. David Frost, another Foreign Office guy, has written in The Telegraph as well, effectively saying we don't have the expertise in these places anymore. It used to be Britain and France regarded as a sort of Rolls-Royce foreign service. Is that... I think, and if that is the case, why is that the case? Are we not recruiting the right people? Are we not letting them stay there long enough? What is it?
I think it is that, Tim. I mean, and in a way, this doesn't need to be that political. I mean, the idea that you should move officials every 2 or 3 years, I don't really understand how anyone could justify that when it erodes expertise entirely. I mean, the entire justification for our permanent civil service is meant to be that the officials have deep wells of expertise that the constantly shuffling ministers don't have, right? But the reality is that the officials are also shuffling around every 2 or 3 years. And other foreign ministries don't do it that way. I mean, some do it like us, but others, they might keep an ambassador in place for 10, 15 years, right? And so I do think we need to look at that rotational model, which, I do think is a bit bonkers. We don't keep people in place for long enough. And I think that directly links to what you were saying, Ben, about not getting really creative, bold ideas, right? Because to come up with something that departs from the status quo, a really bold idea, you've got to have the intellectual confidence that comes from really knowing the subject matter inside out and having spent 10 years working on, say, Israel or Iran.
I mean, how long were you at the Foreign Office for?
For 11 years.
11 years. And did you see anything change at that time? Because one criticism some people in the Foreign Office sometimes have is, you look about the FCDO, it's the addition of the development functions, and the influx and the sort of tensions caused by that might have changed something in the Foreign Office culture.
Yeah. I think most people I speak to in the Foreign Office agree that since the merger, we've focused more and more on this fluffy, cuddly stuff rather than the really hard-nosed foreign policy, national security questions. Maybe that was always inevitable if you're suddenly, becoming a department which, subsumes the Department for International Development. But it's certainly been a challenge. I mean, I support the merger because I think it's absolutely right that, the Foreign Secretary and indeed ambassadors have all of the influence that comes from being able to also exert influence over what we're spending our aid budget on, right? I mean, before you had an absurd situation where, African presidents would nod along politely when the ambassador goes to see them, but really the person they were interested in was the DFID head of country office.
Who had the Wonga.
Had the Wonga, right? Yeah. And likewise, when the Foreign Secretary went in and saw the prime ministers and the presidents, they nodded along politely, but they were really interested in the development secretary and what they had to say. So I think the merger was right, but it has had an impact, which is that we seem to be focusing ever more on this sort of cuddly, fluffy stuff. I mean, practical, tangible examples are sort of useful. I'm reading on the intranet in my last few days in the office about, what we're doing to clean up the air pollution in, a South American city that I think has, better air quality than London. Should we be spending our aid budget on that? I don't think so. And should the senior leadership of the Foreign Office be sort of messaging to staff that this is what we're about? I don't think so. I think it should be messaging to staff that, we need to think about the Middle East, Russia, China.
I mean, Ben, what this comes down to, doesn't it, is hard and soft power. And when you were sort of working with David Lammy, you were almost trying to sort of fuse the two. My sense is some of the problems are systemic, some of them are organisational. But to what degree is there a sort of ideological problem? I mean, a lot of those people who worked for DFID, who went into the building, probably bluntly were picking between a career in an aid agency or going to work for DFID. They've now gone into the Foreign Office. To what degree is the Foreign Office very comfortable with the soft power stuff, but actually a bit sort of queasy about the hard power? In essence, they quite like the progressive bit of your formulation, but didn't really like the realist bit very much. Is that fair criticism of the institution?
If I ever get a chance to serve in government again and in King Charles Street again, I'll push to change the name. Let's drop Commonwealth and have the Foreign Security and Development Office. The Commonwealth has seen its day. It's not a priority of British foreign policy. And I think having the FSDO with security in the name will focus the mind on realpolitik and threats to the homeland, which are so important right now.
The other thing we're not talking about is that the Foreign Office is sort of in turmoil at the moment. They're losing a lot of people. Oliver Robbins, who's the permanent secretary, is doing a reorganisation. I mean, early in his tenure, he had to send a message to staff internally, which was linked to Gaza, where a lot of people didn't like the Labour government's initial more pro-Israeli position than the one they have now. Robbins had to actually tell people, you know, if you don't want to support government policy, you can go and work somewhere else. I mean, it does feel like there's a bit of a wrestling between the politicians and the permanent staff there on controversial issues.
But he's absolutely right to be pushing through the agenda which David Lammy began to get rid of some of this dead wood at the top. There is a huge amount of kind of great young talent below which is struggling to get up, and this agenda is really supported internally.
This is because people are, you know, you can only do certain things when you're on a certain grade and all the rest of it, and it's difficult to move on that kind of middle management tier. Is that what you're saying?
So the Foreign Office became very top-heavy, especially under Liz Truss. Whenever there was a problem, let's make a director and have them in charge of it. And that has sort of blocked talent getting up the system. You know, maybe if the reforms had come sooner, our good friend would still be in there.
Yeah. I mean, I would say I agree, absolutely. The Foreign Office is bloated, and the current workforce reductions are right? The current...
Because a lot of the people Robbins is getting rid of are the sort of DFID types, as I understand it. We ought to have more kind of...
Well, I would hope so,
proper diplomats,
but I don't have any great confidence, actually, that the Foreign Office will be left with the really good people. Right. I think a lot of the good people will just go, right? Because, again, I talk in this article about these weird civil service behaviours that guide Foreign Office recruitment and promotion. And again, those are the sort of same things that people will be looking at in deciding who gets to stay and who gets to go. So they'll be keeping people that can jump through the corporate hoops rather than the real subject matter experts, right? I mean, I would also just say, I mean, the current headcount of the FCDO is greater than the sum total of the two legacy departments. So it's far too bloated. But this is all a result of just absolutely hopeless workforce management, whereby, you know, the Foreign Office has been recruiting, you know, like in the hundreds and thousands for the last few years. We recruited far too many people, and now we're in the unfortunate position of having to let a lot of people go.
I was really struck in 2021 by some of the reporting around the culture at the Foreign Office, the inability or unwillingness for staff to go back and work in that Afghan evacuation, and the scenes we saw at that. Does that sort of chime with what you've seen subsequently, that kind of maybe lack of pride, or the sense it's just doing the 9 to 5 rather than kind of sense of, I know, national pride that one would hope to find in our...
And has any of that changed? Because I mean, I was about to ask the same thing. I mean, you had this list of people who were trying to get out, and nobody was there to deal with it.
I think there was one person on the desk or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, the permanent secretary was away, the foreign secretary was away, and a lot of people working from home still. Has that changed, or is that still a kind of default case, even in a crisis?
Yeah.
You know, if there's a crisis at a magazine or a newspaper, we all pile into the office. There seem to be, you know, Kabul's literally falling, and they seem reluctant to do that.
Yeah, I think, look, I mean, there's a lot there. Work from home is an issue. I mean, the Foreign Office is not getting 60% of people, staff are not in 60% of the time, which is the official target. The stats are out there in the public domain. They're not meeting that. So work from home is a problem. I mean, on the broader sort of issue of you know, commitment to the job and 9 to 5 working, I actually think there are officials. There's plenty of officials that want to feel the excitement and the adventure of working in this great office of state. And are willing to come in the evenings and go down into the Foreign Office bunker, which is where the crisis room is. The problem, in a way, is the senior leadership of the office that almost discourage it. I mean, I remember a sort of diktat coming around by email to all staff from one of the Director Generals. And she was not only was she the board champion for diversity and inclusion, because they all need to be a champion for one of these causes, but she was also the board champion for flexible working, right? And, you know, essentially the point being made was that the Foreign Office was failing to meet its targets on flexible working. I think the figure was 6.1% of Foreign Office staff were flexible working, and that wasn't high enough because we needed to get higher, because higher flexible working improved our diversity and inclusion objectives and all the rest of it. So essentially, if the messaging is that, we want staff to work part-time, we want staff to work from home, we want staff to work flexibly, rather than, trying to capitalize on this sense that you're working in a great office of state where, yes, you might need to work until 10 o'clock at night some days, and that's what the job is about. So I think the problem is with the messaging from senior leadership.
Ben, did you find this? I mean, you didn't have a crisis quite like this one, but you've had quite a few on your docket while you were there. Did you find when you wanted that support that it wasn't there? In the political office, there's just not enough people in the office, or they weren't sort of able to step up when you needed it?
I found the Foreign Office is actually quite good at dealing with crisis. Great teams, good advice, could snap into action. There's one thing I wanted to push back gently on, which is, I'm a progressive, and I think there is value in certain efforts to promote diversity. And let's be honest about the Foreign Office. When one gets to the top of it, it feels a little bit like the Hurlingham Club entrance committee. It is pretty pale and male. Now talk to French diplomats. Now French diplomacy is as white as a camembert, and they're so jealous at how our embassies around the world look like Britain, sound like Britain, and get better results. So I totally agree that there might be some excesses. Like I agree sort of potentially World Afro Day on the day of a major global crisis, is a bad idea. But I do think the Foreign Office needed a bit of that. It's just in general, the sort of woke revolution has clearly sort of gone off into excesses. But let's not be sort of against diversity.
But I think it didn't come at the expense of other things, I suppose, is the question.
That's totally true. But let's not forget either that the Foreign Office did need a bit of
you found,
more
I think, with David Lammy that when he went to certain parts of the world, he got a hearing that some other foreign secretaries might not have got because of how he looks, and that the same effect would work for a diplomat as well.
Nothing annoys the Russians more than sort of old perfidious Albion suddenly being new multicultural and multiracial Britain. That's fantastic. It's a huge asset. And I think you were a really important part of that in your posting in Ekaterinburg. And I loved how effective you were over there.
Thank you, Ben. I mean, I would make the point, if the Foreign Office did need a diversity and inclusion boost, I'm not sure it needs it any longer, and I'm not sure it needs to be obsessing over it any longer. I mean, I think 12 months ago, 3/4 of the most senior ambassadors were all women. So great. I mean, but look at the stats. Our ambassador in China, in the United States, in France, in Japan, they were all women. So that's great. So I don't think the senior leadership need to be spending their time now obsessing over how we can up our diversity and inclusion stats.
I mean, I think one point of diversity which you would maybe agree with is about professional diversity, in the sense of getting more people from different backgrounds into Whitehall. It doesn't matter so much their race or gender maybe these days, but the question is, do you think the Foreign Office is too kind of maybe unrepresentative in sort of the people it's drawing itself from, or kind of their areas of expertise?
Yeah, I do think there's something about getting more private sector people into the Foreign Office, and not just the Foreign Office. This is something that applies to the civil service more broadly. And not just private sector people, but a private sector mentality and a private sector culture, right? I mean, there is almost no results-based promotion in the Foreign Office. As I say, not only recruitment, but promotion is based on these very weird, amorphous civil service competencies or civil service behaviours, rather than asking straightforwardly, what do you know about the China file? Or what did you achieve in your last role? What were the results? That private sector sort of mentality, I think we need far more of that, because, at the moment we have a situation where people are, Foreign Office people, to their credit, are very good at coming up to speed quite quickly, but there's no sort of substitute for genuine expertise built over many years and experience in the country you're in, and all the things like language capability and all the rest, they all are sort of part of that, right? We need people to speak the languages. We need people to have lived in the countries concerned previously. We need more people going back on second postings to the same country, right? At the moment, on Japan and on China, we're pretty good at that, in the sense that the ambassador to Japan has normally served once before in that country. But that's actually the exception to the rule, right? Normally, an ambassador is appointed, or a senior head of political section is appointed to a country they've literally never been served, they've never served in before, they've often never visited before.
Yeah, some of this diversity stuff, I think people in a lot of government departments would talk about. It feels like this may not be just an affliction of the Foreign Office, as it were. But the reason all this stuff matters at the moment is because we're in this extraordinary period of international tumult. I'd be interested in both of your views on how Britain generally is approaching that. We seem a little bit tentative and uncertain. We saw that, the stuff I've written this week on Iran, where the Prime Minister was trying to tiptoe his way into one position and the rest of his NSC was pushing him the other way, and then they got there after 48 hours. It just feels like we haven't yet adjusted to the world of America being quite as erratic, the Europeans kind of wanting our security help, but not really being any more willing to give over sort of economic, kind of give ground economically in the way that the government's trying to negotiate. I mean, you were absolutely front and centre of the initial sort of relationship building with the Americans. What have we got right there, and what are we potentially now getting wrong? How should we be approaching this erratic actor that's, traditionally our most important big ally anyway?
I mean, I completely agree with you about the state of the world right now. It's not a world war, but when you have some of the great cities of the earth, like Kiev, Dubai, Tel Aviv, Beirut, all under assault at once, we've got to be honest with ourselves. This is more than two connected regional wars. We are in a period of world chaos. I think there needs to be a much more sort of disciplined approach to realpolitik in the Foreign Office, and I think there needs to be a much greater awareness in the country of what we're living through. One of the things that, if I was still in government, I would be advising to do is that we really need to get out there, declassify a lot of stuff, and just explain to the public how bad and how dangerous this situation is with Russia and what they're doing. Something that I think...
Because you don't get more money for defence unless you explain what the threat is. And there have been a few efforts to do that.
And of course, before Ukraine as well, do you remember the Foreign Office declassified some of the signals intelligence, which stopped Putin from establishing a false pretext for the war?
I couldn't agree more. I think we need to have a lot more courage in telling the public just how bad it is. And I wish I could say more, but of course can't. I see a problem coming down the track, which is China. And with the teams that I work with in the Foreign Office, really, I thought the top teams there were pretty strong. The Russia team was excellent, the Middle East team was excellent, the embassy was excellent. But the China team, I think we need to raise the level there. Jake Sullivan in the United States had a whole network around him of experts on 5G who were cleared or semi-cleared, being brought into the system, financial experts, robotics experts. He had a huge team around him that could really get into every specific issue of what Chinese hard power was. I don't think we're
This was
we're there.
Biden's national security advisor and
Absolutely.
worked for Obama as well. So the top Democrat foreign policy guy
Absolutely.
for a decade.
Absolutely.
basically.
The king of that think tank come security world, who was really leading American foreign policy. And like Tony Blinken, his Secretary of State that I got to know in my previous job, and his was spending a lot of time focusing on China, understanding the debates about global China. There are real risks there coming down the track. And if I was going to sort of advise a foreign secretary to get on something right now, it would be look ahead, look at that Taiwan file. Are we remotely ready for the consular? Are we remotely ready for all of those interdependencies? Things that we think are unthinkable are suddenly becoming thinkable. Look at the Brits in Dubai.
I agree with Ben on China. We need far more China capability. And I'd like to see the office think creatively about how we meet that demand. I mean, maybe some of the very smart Hong Kongers that have come here, if they can pass security clearance, those are exactly the sort of people we might want. They've got language capability and all the rest. But, we need to think about it. I agree with Ben on that.
And what about the Americans? What should our sort of approach to the Americans be? Because everybody accepts that, call it what you want, let's just, hideous phrase, the special relationship. There are special bits of it which will continue to function regardless of what's going on at the political level. But the political level at the moment is causing more problems. And a lot of them are not just sounding off. They then have a policy implication.
Let me have a go at that.
The next debate is, are they going to remain our sort of foundational ally or not? Do we need to be gathering other groups of people? We've seen this stuff from Carney about the Middle Powers. You've got the French extending their nuclear umbrella across more of Europe. How do we approach all that, do you think?
Well, look, the first thing that if I sort of was advising an ambassador in Washington, it would be just ban the phrase the special relationship. It's needy, it's weak, it sets the wrong expectations. We've never followed America everywhere. We've got an unbreakable bond with America. It's withstood 1776, 1956, no to Vietnam. We've got these incredible capacities we've built together. Come on, can we just have a bit of confidence, please? Just because we're not participating at the moment in a deeply unpopular, in the United States and unclearly defined bombing run doesn't mean that hundreds of years of history are out the window. Please, this country needs to get its confidence back.
No, but the British government's response to that was done in such a sort of slow way that we've managed to annoy the Americans, we've managed to annoy the Gulf Arabs. And you sort of think if we were more confident in what our posture was, we could have more confidently said, no, we're not joining the bombing, but we will join the defensive capability stuff, which is what we signed up to on Sunday evening, having not signed up to it on Friday evening. And it feels like there's just this sort of uncertainty about things. And keeping those Gulf alliances is important, isn't it? That's a strategic objective. Absolutely. It ought to be, anyway.
So I think there's kind of three parts to that.
Yeah.
I think that you needed to be out there explaining to the British public in a lot more detail that there really is a risk of war and it's going to affect you at the petrol pump. Things are going to be turbulent. I think the government could have done that a couple of weeks earlier, or even a couple of months, or even a couple of years earlier. That's the first thing, just telling people how unstable the situation is internationally. The second thing is, we have an America problem. The so-called special relationship.
You nearly said it, Ben.
I nearly said it.
We're going to have to sort of fight to get this out of our language.
Well, it's actually part of the popular culture because the special relations that exist is between people.
Yes.
Our closest, security relationship with the United States, has become a bit of a problem for us because they've become so profoundly sort of erratic and turbulent and emotional right now. We need to be kind of diversifying our alliances, and for me, that means taking a look at two batches of allies. The first is doing a lot more to work with the Europeans to make sure that there is more of a European geopolitical pole in the world, and there just isn't right now, with different Europeans going in different directions. And the other is with the CANZUK countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and the UK. I think that's been a bit neglected. I think we can do quite a lot to bring those partners together. And one thing I was actually doing in the Foreign Office when I was engaging in a bit of policy planning was trying to get a proposal up to suggest that we could start branding statements as such between those countries, getting an occasional family photo, looking at areas where the Americans had retreated, where we could do more together. But it was actually killed in the policy process by none other than the late Peter Mandelson.
Ameer, your response?
Yeah, look, I agree on CANZUK. I think, the Aussies, the Canadians, New Zealanders, great partners. We have loads in common. Let's continue to deepen our relationship with them. But just two other points. I mean, as you say, Tim, this is not just about the relationship with the Americans. It's about the relationship with the Israelis, the Gulfies, the Emiratis. None of them are impressed with how the current government have dealt with the Iran crisis. I think that our inconstancy, our dithering and delay, all of that has burnt our credibility with those partners. And, I think there is a valid debate to be had about how far we get dragged into the current Iran conflict. I understand people that are wary of a never-ending Middle Eastern war, but the fact that we haven't even robustly defended sovereign British territory in Cyprus, I find frankly a bit bizarre. And the fact that we've been so caught off guard, I find very, very strange, because we all know that the HMS Dragon, this relevant ship, is not arriving in theatre for another 2 weeks and all the rest of it. I was in the embassy in Tel Aviv. It's been absolutely clear for weeks now that US-Israeli action on Iran is highly likely. Our ambassador in Israel, Simon Walters, is fantastic. He did his job. He's been closely monitoring Israeli intent vis-a-vis Iran and feeding that back to London. So I don't understand why ministers...
They had no excuse to be blindsided, essentially. And the first American request to use the bases was on February the 11th. And by the time Dragon gets there, a month will have elapsed before we have a boat in the area.
Even things like the impact on energy prices. I mean, perhaps there was an analyst in, Treasury beavering away on what the implication of conflict would be on energy prices and bills. But I would have thought the embassy in Tel Aviv would be copied into those emails, and I didn't see a single thing about that. So I don't think we prepared for this in the way that we should have. And I don't think it's the embassy's fault. I think it was, perhaps it was ministers beholden to international law who just sort of instinctively didn't want us to get involved because there was a sense that international law was steering us to not do so.
There seems to be a view that international law is very fixed, though. Whereas if you look at what Mark Carney, Anthony Albanese in Australia have said, what the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has said, where he basically said, I'm not sure it's a great guide to what's going on at the moment, and I'm confident that what's happening is legal. This is a matter of interpretations, and certainly Starmer and Hermer seem to take a more absolutist view of it. The thing that's striking to me, out of the reporting I've done out of that National Security Council meeting on the Friday, is that the reasoning for not going ahead with it was not just the stuff you're talking about. You could make a perfectly legitimate and respectable argument saying we don't want to unleash a regional war, we're worried about the cost of living in this country and we don't want to push up oil prices, we would like to persuade you not to do this. But the rationale that Ed Miliband, who seems to have been the decisive voice in that room, gave was, oh, well, do we want to please Donald Trump at the moment? No, we don't, because that's not very popular with the Labour Party. And that seems like a slightly unfortunate way to be making a decision like this. Do you agree? I mean, is that... Has Labour got a bit in a mess over this? Because they've lost a by-election to the Greens, who mobilised the Muslim vote. It feels like domestic and international politics are getting quite sort of dangerously entwined now.
Really, the kind of foreign policy we want is one that begins and ends with the British national interest. And one of the questions for me is how the right seem to be drifting a little bit away from prioritising that right now. Everything that I've learnt about foreign policy on this earth and in the Foreign Office is that you've really got to think through what you're doing. And what recent history is telling us is, please don't forget the lessons of Iraq, Libya and Afghanistan. I wouldn't try and assemble an IKEA flat pack without a plan and clearly defined objective of what I'm trying to build, let alone engage in the kind of military offensive action which the Americans and the Israelis are doing in Iran right now. Over the last few days, we've seen it described in terms of regime change, regime deal. It's just not clear enough. And I think that the government's position is realist right now. That is what I clearly see there. And I think that for me is a lot more important than these questions about international law. I think that the current position is reflective of UK national interest.
But what do we do to influence any of this now? What should Britain be doing then to try and bring the conflict to an end, or to have it end in a way that is helpful rather than unhelpful? Because my reflection from the conversations I've had over the last week is that we've surrendered quite a lot of goodwill, and the more passionately Labour MPs seem to feel about something, the less influence we probably have in persuading anybody else out there of the situation.
Look, two things. The first is I'm always very suspicious of diplomats and senior security officials shouting, well, if we don't do this, we'll be irrelevant. Well, irrelevant to what? What are you talking about? Is the action we're taking keeping Britain safe, or is it contributing in some way to making Britain rich or keeping our allies and our partners safe? When somebody just sort of goes, how are we relevant in this crisis? I'm always quite suspicious of that. Another thing that's kind of important to that's important to say is, we are actually doing quite a lot to kind of protect allies and partners in the Gulf and to protect our people.
But we didn't get a lot of credit for that, I think, because of how long it took to respond. And
I think that this war's going to go on for a while. The first few days in any big conflict tend not to reflect the course of something that might last months or I and people are going to kind of give running commentary at the beginning that doesn't reflect where we're going to be in the middle or the end. I think I do see in terms of new deployments at Al Udeid Air Base where I've been actually in Qatar.
I spent 2 months of my life there in 2003.
There's, the UK is doing stuff. But this comes back to the kind of bigger question for me, which is we need a higher defence budget. We need a higher investment in security. We need to get our institutions much more focused on the national interest and British security. And I think you need to do a lot more to tell the public actually how bad it is. And there's too much of a tendency in government comms to try and say how good things are or how under control things are.
Tim, should we just give the final word to Ameer?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, look, in terms of what the UK can do to help end this, Tim, I'm not sure there's much we can do to end it, but we certainly can do a better job of standing by long-standing allies. You know, the US, the Israelis, the Emiratis, the Gulfies, and, you know, not micromanage the Americans to such an extent over how they use our base. If we've got the base, we should allow them to use it, or they'll probably just conclude it's just not worth the trouble. Just on what Ben said, though, to finish, I mean, he said that our foreign policy should begin and end with the national interest. And I absolutely agree. But ultimately, I don't think it is at the moment. You know, we are distracted by what international law might require. And it's a very, as I say, rigid, inflexible approach to international law that is taken by Hermer and Starmer. But we're also distracted by, I think we should be honest, sectarian voting blocs back home. I saw this day in, day out, leading in the Palestinian affairs team in Tel Aviv. Our policy on Israel-Palestine and on Gaza is absolutely being dictated by Labour backbenchers and by the demands of sectarian voting blocs back home. So this is no way to decide on our foreign policy. The foreign policy that we take, our foreign policy making, should be an exercise in simply weighing up what is in the national interest and how we best achieve that. And at the moment, I don't think it is.
Well, as Ben said, providing a running commentary on these issues is always problematic, but we've hopefully given you some insights today, and James and I will be back with further running commentary, no doubt, in weeks to come.
Thank you.